Where do they go? The smoke rings I blow each night. Oh, what do they do? Those circles of blue and white.
Enemy Number One, Waging the War on Secondhand Smoke, is a memoir that chronicles the decades-long struggle by non-smokers to achieve smoke-free air in workplaces against the malevolent forces of Big Tobacco, who was determined to preserve the pollution of restaurants and bars and other workplaces. It is written by a scientist whose pioneering work measuring indoor air pollution provided crucial support to the nascent non-smokers' rights movement. From the 1920s on, when smoking began to become prevalent, non-smokers began to increasingly suffer from heavily polluted air from secondhand smoke in public places, as addicted smokers began to take the right to smoke anywhere for granted. Non-smokers acquiesced to what became an arrogant right to pollute ethic just after Earth Day in 1970, when the non-smokers' rights movement took root. As this graph of the terms passive smoking, environmental tobacco smoke, and involuntary smoking shows, the movement began to pick up steam in the early 1980s as the new science of secondhand smoke, coupled with health-based air quality standards borrowed from outdoor air, took hold. As a veteran of the post-Earth Day movement for clean indoor air and clean outdoor air, in the mid-1970s, Naval Research Laboratory physicist James Rapace had an epiphany. He had never seen the outdoor air as polluted as any bar or restaurant. So he and a scientist colleague, Dr. Alfred Lowry, conducted a series of controlled experiments measuring secondhand smoke in a ventilated office building conference room to research the effect of smoking on indoor air in a common setting. As this graph of indoor air pollution versus time shows, the cigarette smoke from just 4 chain smokers in a conference room capable of holding 50 persons, where about 11 regular smokers would be expected to be at any time. Within a half an hour, the respirable particle smoke density increased from 50 to almost 2,000 micrograms per cubic meter of room air. By comparison, EPA's health-based significant harm level for particulate air pollution was about 800 micrograms per cubic meter. By today's standards, any level above 500 is considered hazardous to public health. As this graph shows, this level was exceeded in this ventilated office conference room within about 4 minutes. After a half an hour, it was quadruple that level. In 1978, the only restaurant in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area that had a non-smoking section was Denny's restaurant chain. Jim Rapace and Clara Goen are shown here with a real-time portable air pollution monitor. Using this device, scientists Jim Rapace, Al Lowry, and John O'Hara, with the aid of the Group Against Smokers Pollution founder Clara Goen, measured indoor air quality and as well as outdoor air for 56 microenvironments, including the homes of smokers, smoky restaurants and bars, bowling alleys and bingo games, weddings and waiting rooms, dinner dances, and dives. For comparison, they measured air quality in non-smoking venues, including libraries and churches and homes of non-smokers. They used this data in an attempt to persuade the Prince George's County, Maryland Council to pass a law requiring smoking sections in all restaurants and bars in this Washington, D.C. suburb. At this time, this Maryland county was home to many tobacco farms. The bill's opponents were tobacco farmers, the local business community, and of course, the dark forces of Big Tobacco. In a contentious hearing before the Prince George's County Council, Dr. John O'Hara, a federal scientist who was president of Bowie, Maryland GASP chapter, turned out more than 100 fed-up non-smokers to testify in favor of the proposed bill to establish smoking sections in restaurants and public buildings. Together with the data and experiments of Rapace and Lowry, they succeeded on August 11, 1978, over the angry protests of the tobacco lobby. Rapace and Lowry then published a 10-page article entitled Indoor Air Pollution, Tobacco Smoke, and Public Health in a prominent journal, Science Magazine. Their paper demonstrated that smoking under typical conditions of building occupancy, smoking prevalence, and ventilation failed to control levels of air pollution from smoking, exceeding the level of federal air quality standards for clean air. As this graph of fine particle pollution shows, all of the measurements made in smoking buildings average 5 to 7 times as great as outdoors. That's these red diamonds here. By comparison, the levels in the non-smoking buildings and outdoors were considerably lower. These levels here, 40% of the data measured in smoking buildings exceeded the now antiquated health-based 24-hour air quality standards for total suspended particulate air pollution. However, judged by today's far more stringent air quality fine particle standards, all of the smoking venues were polluted to unhealthy to hazardous levels and beyond, under typical conditions of occupancy, smoking, and ventilation. 2 weeks prior to publication, Big Tobacco learned of the existence of the Rapace and Lowry paper during a debate between Rapace and Tobacco Institute mouthpiece Walker Merriman on a local Washington, D.C. TV station. The Tobacco Institute's Director of Statistics promptly wrote a letter to Dr. Philip Abelson, editor of Science, in a futile plea to prevent the paper from being published. This launched the tobacco wars, pitting Rapace against Big Tobacco in an epic David and Goliath battle destined to persist for decades. As the Office of Research Integrity of the United States Department of Health and Human Services noted 25 years later, quote, "In most scientific fields, the rewards go to investigators who report positive findings. But in the environmental sciences, the situation is the opposite. Positive findings about hazards and risks are threatening to powerful interests. Investigators who study or report these risks are therefore at increased risk for harassment by the very nature of their work. Environmental professionals measure and report health risks from exposures to toxic and physical agents so that preventive measures can be put into effect. As a result, they may be subjected to harassment, lawsuits, ostracism, job loss, loss of funding, intimidation, abuse, threats, or even force after reporting such risks, or are prevented from investigating or reporting risks altogether. In the early 1980s, the Tobacco Institute launched the first of a long series of attacks on Rapace and Lowry's work by employing the services of the so-called independent scientists who were in reality industrial-strength tobacco industry moles whose bogus criticism was directed and paid for by the shyster lawyers employed by Big Tobacco. One of their chief servants was the notorious Professor Theodore Sterling of Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada, who would prove to be a reliable weapon in the industry's arsenal. Not content with attacks by its moles, the Tobacco Institute issued broadsides to serve as fodder for paid advertising in newspapers and magazines. One such ad appeared in Time magazine in 1983. It is shown here. It asserted falsely that a non-smoker would have to spend 100 hours straight in a smoky bar to inhale the equivalent of a single filter cigarette. Actually, this could happen to a bartender in a single day. Adding to the industry's problems, in 1981, Japanese and Greek epidemiologists Takeshi Hirayama and Dimitri Trikopoulos reported studies indicating that the non-smoking wives of cigarette smokers had approximately a doubled risk of lung cancer mortality relative to the non-smoking wives of non-smokers. Hirayama's passive smoking study of 98,000 women over 16 years obviously posed a major threat to the tobacco industry, so they hired prominent American University professor and statistician Nathan Mantell to criticize Hirayama's work. Mantell responded by writing a vague letter in response, speculating that Hirayama might have made an error, but in an interview with Medical World News, he later denied that he reached a firm conclusion. In spite of this contradiction, Mantell's speculation and the paid opinions of other industry moles were cited as actually confirming that Hirayama had made a fundamental arithmetical error. This was actually a bald-faced lie. Hitting below the belt, the Tobacco Institute characterized the increasing numbers of irate non-smokers who complained about tobacco smoke pollution of workplaces and public buildings as health Nazis, comparing them, as shown here, to Adolf Hitler, whom they characterized as history's most famous anti-smoker. This industrial-strength propaganda maligning non-smokers sickened by indoor air pollution from tobacco products as anti-smokers was a blatant attempt to galvanize the opposition of addicted smokers in order to combat proposed smoke-free workplace laws. Utilizing the work of Hirayama, Trikopoulos, and Larry Garfinkel of the American Cancer Society, Rapace and Lowry managed to calculate the magnitude of lung cancer mortality from passive smoking among U.S. non-smokers. Their work, published in the peer-reviewed journal Environment International, estimated that 5,000 deaths per year with an estimated average loss of life expectancy of 17 years. Based on extrapolation from mortality in smokers, they estimated a lower bound of 500 deaths per year, still quite significant by U.S. regulatory standards. Prior to publication, Rapace and Lowry's work was featured in a 3-minute segment on TV in the 7 o'clock CBS Evening News with Dan Rather. Rapace was interviewed in his office at EPA. The CBS program attracted the interest of the New York Times. The following Saturday, November 3, 1984, a lengthy story ran with the caption, "EPA Study Links Deaths of Non-Smokers to Cigarette." The article noted that, quote, recent attempts to require the segregation of smokers have been made in such widely separated places as Suffolk County, New York on Long Island, and San Francisco. Caught flat-footed, the tobacco industry was barraged with, quote, lousy news stories, unquote, embarrassing their lobbyists in legislative hearings around the country. This despite the fact that the paper had yet to appear in print. The Tobacco Institute's propaganda machine then went into high gear, issuing a brochure, quote, Situation Report, Tobacco Smoke in the Air, which continued its fraudulent attacks on Rapace and Lowry's 1980 research as well as Hirayama's and Trikopoulos' work in 1981. The brochure maligned Rapace and Lowry as, quote, vocal anti-smoking activists, unquote. The publicity surrounding the Rapace and Lowry risk assessment prompted EPA Assistant Administrator for Air and Radiation Joseph A. Cannon to fund a National Academy of Sciences study on environmental tobacco smoke. Rapace solicited co-funding for the study by the Office on Smoking and Health, which prepared the U.S. Surgeon General's reports. This resulted in two back-to-back reports in 1986, one by the National Research Council on Environmental Tobacco Smoke, funded by EPA, and the other became the 1986 Surgeon General's report on involuntary smoking. Both of these independently produced reports agreed with the conclusions of Rapace and Lowry that secondhand smoke caused lung cancer in non-smokers. By this time, the Tobacco Institute became so enraged that they used the Tobacco State Congressman, ranking minority member of the powerful House Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, Don Sundquist, to make bogus conflict of interest accusations of Rapace in an effort to get him fired from EPA. Sundquist asserted, quote, that Rapace could not give a fair hearing to the tobacco company's side, unquote. After a 6-month investigation by EPA's Office of Inspector General, Rapace was acquitted of all charges. At this time, Rapace helped found EPA's Indoor Air Quality Program and set its technical agenda on two primary issues: environmental tobacco smoke and sick buildings. The Indoor Air Program asked EPA's Carcinogen Assessment Group to conduct an official EPA risk assessment. EPA's effort leads to a report entitled Health Effects of Passive Smoking, Assessment of Lung Cancer in Adults and Respiratory Disorders in Children. EPA's official estimate was 3,000 deaths per year, with a range of about 800 to 7,000 deaths. This compares with Rapace and Lowry's 1985 and 1990 updated estimates of 5,000 plus or minus 2,500 deaths. Subsequent estimates of total mortality include mortality from heart disease, raising total estimated deaths to 50,000 or more. In 1989, Surgeon General C. Everett Koop awarded Rapace the Surgeon General's Medallion as a co-belligerent in the fight against smoking. As shown here, the EPA report triggered an exponential increase of workplace smoke-free laws in the United States from 0 in 1992 to nearly 500 in 2012. In 1998, Rapace retired from EPA and started an indoor air secondhand smoke consulting firm, Rapace Associates Incorporated, which performed international consulting and litigation support. Obtaining research grants from the Flight Attendant Medical Research Institute and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in 2002, Rapace procured 21st century monitoring equipment and conducted several research studies. Among these is a measurement of secondhand smoke before and after a statewide smoking ban in Delaware. The study, conducted in 6 bars, a casino, and a pool hall in Wilmington, Delaware, shows that post-ban concentration of cancer-causing particulates from pre-ban smoking, which is in this top box here, declined by 90 to 95% to outdoor background levels. When the Delaware study was published in 2004, a science writer at the Associated Press, Linda Johnson, wrote a lengthy story. It was widely reported in 530 media outlets around the world, including radio, television, newspapers, magazine, as well as online. It reached a worldwide audience of nearly 500 million people, leading to a rapid increase in smoking bans in workplaces in the U.S., Canada, and overseas. In 2012, Jim Rapace and Wayne Ott, who was a professor at Stanford, plotted the decrease in the nicotine metabolite, cotinine, as reported by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, versus the increase in the number of statewide smoking laws. As you can see from this graph, it declined from 1994 levels to levels in 2010 by almost 80%, suggesting that relative to 1992, when the EPA report was issued, an estimated 40,000 deaths per year have been avoided. These tales, and many more, including the many lawsuits involving non-smokers injured or killed by passive smoking, are described in this new book. If you are interested in the science, the public policy, or the drama of fighting corporate interests, powerful corporate interests, and the best Congress that money can buy, you will want to read this book. The table of contents is displayed here, and the book is divided into 3 parts: the early years, the battles with big tobacco, and the end game. It's for sale on Amazon.com.